The last video for Chapter 5 will focus on two things: gender identity and how gender looks in minority or non-dominant cultures within the US. So to start, I want to go over what exactly androgyny is. This is a word I think we hear sometimes and don't really understand where it comes from or what it's referring to. So we know, of course, that the term femininity or feminine refers to the idea of being a woman, which typically, traditionally, involves two characteristics: being nurturing and being compliant. We call these expressive traits, things that allow women, again, in the traditional gender mindset, to foster and maintain relationships. On the other hand, masculinity is the idea of being independent and aggressive. We call these instrumental traits, traits that allow a man to go and get things done, to accomplish, to achieve. Again, these are, of course, very traditional, stereotypical concepts of what is feminine and what is masculine. They do have a biological basis, but they're largely socially constructed ideas. Yes, women might be biologically predisposed to being nurturing, to being compliant, and men might be biologically predisposed to being more aggressive. But most of what goes in to our expectations for feminine and masculine are completely socially constructed. Meaning that, of course, there's many women out there who are extremely independent and aggressive themselves. And there's many men out in the world who are very nurturing and compliant. So where does that put us? The best thing to keep in mind here is that the idea that femininity and masculinity are complete opposites that exist independently of one another, that you're either one or the other, is not true. Each of these traits exists on a spectrum, so most people fall somewhere in between. The word androgyny actually means a combination of male and female traits. So rather than thinking of masculinity and femininity like this, as either one or the other, it's important to keep in mind that it's actually a continuum, and most people exist somewhere in between, where, yeah, I have some masculine traits. For the most part, I'm masculine, but I have some feminine traits too, or yeah, I'm pretty feminine, but I'm kind of in the middle. So the word androgyny, while some individuals might identify as being completely gender androgynous, they feel very much in the middle. The word androgyny doesn't mean necessarily lacking gender. It means having a mix of all of these different traits, which of course most individuals do. The next topic I want to look at is the idea of being gender nonconforming. Gender nonconforming is a gender identity where a person feels that their behavior, their person, doesn't fit into a conventional gender norm. They don't identify as male or female. There's a typo there. They may identify as male or female, but still not fit conventional norms sometimes as well, where they feel that their gender is female, but female to them is very different from what female means in the traditional sense of the word. I want to point out that gender nonconforming does not indicate someone's sexual orientation. You can be gender nonconforming and be straight. You can be gender nonconforming and identify also as LGBTQ+. This is just a gender identity, not a sexual orientation. The same is true for being transgender. Transgender is an individual, or means an individual has a gender identity that differs from their biological sex. So they have the chromosomes of a male, X and Y, but they are female. They identify as female. Their gender is female. Again, this does not indicate their sexual orientation. And sometimes transgendered individuals choose to undergo gender-conforming surgery, but not always. It's totally up to what they feel, what they want, and what makes them comfortable. So you can have a transgendered individual who isn't interested in having, this is something we used to call sexual reassignment surgery, gender-conforming surgery, and you might have another individual who is very interested in having that done. We know that being transgendered or gender nonconforming during adolescence does put an individual at high risk for experiencing aggression against them, for experiencing dating violence, and even for experiencing homelessness, where they're kicked out of their home for their non-traditional gender identity. And even though we know that every individual's experience of developing gender identity is different, some people know from the age of 3 that they're gender nonconforming or transgendered, and some people don't fully develop that part of their identity until adolescence. Adolescence and emerging adulthood tend to be particularly stressful times for these individuals. Unfortunately, that does result in higher rates of suicide in these populations. The last thing I want to talk about, and this is one of my favorite topics to cover in this chapter, we've been talking primarily about dominant culture in America, which means we've been talking specifically about white or European American culture. I want to take a second and look at African American culture and gender, as well as Latinx American culture in America. So let's start by looking at African American women. Keep in mind the dominant gender cultures in America and what they encourage in females. Interestingly enough, we know that in African American culture, women are actually socialized in a way that produces some unique outcomes. They tend to be higher in self-esteem. They tend to be higher in self-reliance and higher in assertiveness. These are the traits socialized in these communities, which of course have some wonderful outcomes for African American women. They also tend to have higher rates of perseverance in the face of challenges, in the face of strife, and often in the face of a system that is designed against them. We also see that African American women tend to be less concerned with physical appearance. I talked in our last video about how the idea of thinness is very predominant for adolescent girls. That's not necessarily true for the dominant culture in the African American community. The body ideal tends to be different, not for everyone, of course, but overall, and because of that, we see less concern with being that ideal level of thinness and less occurrences of eating disorders and dieting. African American men, on the other hand, have a slightly different story. Historically speaking, African American men have had their masculinity threatened. Think about slavery, thinking about the roles that African American men in our community were forced into, historically speaking. Because of that, we've seen a push for African American boys to kind of take ownership back over their masculine traits, which we can, of course, see a strong correlation to from the historical perspective. However, modern culture within the African American male community, and again, I am talking about averages here, this is not true for everyone, but it tends to emphasize physical toughness, risk-taking, and aggressiveness. Again, think about the 3 Ps, provide, protect, and procreate. Very traditional masculine gender roles tend to be emphasized here. We talked in the last lecture video about some of the negative outcomes associated with emphasizing these aspects during gender socialization. Risky behaviors, less interest in school and subsequent poorer performance, higher involvement in crime sometimes because of the reinforcement of these traditional gender norms. Another aspect of this is the negative impact on mental health, where many adolescent boys, not just in the African American community, but also in the African American community, don't feel comfortable seeking help for mental illness. A big part of that is that we can actually see is less emotional expression. They're discouraged from engaging in emotional expression. This, I believe, research has suggested is changing. You can see more modern examples of African American adolescents in our culture who are kind of breaking away from this more recent emphasis placed on that type of masculinity. One example I want to give you is the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. This is something you may or may not be familiar with, but there have been a lot of groups who have recently been pushing to emphasize responsibility and diligence as being those masculine traits desirable in a man, something that makes you a successful man. So the example here, the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, very strong fraternity at traditional Black universities, but also exists at other universities, actually has, as part of their philanthropy, a program that has members of the fraternity work with young boys in their community to help guide them towards what they believe are healthier gender norms for African American boys. So we see some great shifts happening more recently when it comes to hopefully developing what is a healthier gender identity. Again, that is a problem in many different cultures for males, but the African American fraternities are making a great push in many cases to help with that. I mentioned that I also want to take a second to look at Latinx culture in America because we see some interesting differences, but also some interesting similarities here as well. The Latinx culture is historically very traditional. In fact, looking at the traditional gender communities we talked about during Lecture 1, there are traditional cultures still in Mexico, for example, that fall into that category, and that tends to be prevalent in a lot of Latinx American families. Women are socialized under the umbrella of something we call Marianismo, where they're encouraged to emulate or be like the Virgin Mary. Submissiveness and self-denial tend to be the kind of feminine traits valued in these cultures, whereas men are socialized by something we call machismo, where they're encouraged to engage in those 3 Ps: provide, protect, and procreate. More recently, the Latina feminist movement has pushed for a change in the way we're socializing Latina women, where they still want to maintain value on those traditional roles, to not separate them from their culture, but also want to encourage and expand access to other roles, other career opportunities, other ways of being that can also be seen as desirable for a woman. That brings me to the end of Chapter 5. As always, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions.